The NFL draft has the potential to drastically shift the fantasy football landscape every single season. Any given player's fantasy football value could plummet or skyrocket with a single selection during the 3-day event. So with that in mind, here are 5 NFL veterans who escaped the NFL draft and are sitting pretty for the 2024 fantasy football season, all right here, right now, on episode 16 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Zach Moss and Chase Brown emerged from the NFL draft completely unscathed after the Cincinnati Bengals did not select a single running back during the entire NFL draft. Now, Moss and Chase Brown, they're going to compete for touches in a Zach Taylor offense that's finished 16th or better in scoring in each of the last 3 years, including finishing 7th in scoring in both 2021 and 2022. Now, there's no denying that the RB1 role in Zach Taylor's high-powered offense has been a pretty fruitful one in fantasy football over the last several years. In 69 very nice games that Joe Mixon has played since Zach Taylor became the head coach of the Cincinnati Bengals back in 2019, Joe Mixon averaged nearly 20 touches per game at 19.8, including 3.7 targets per game. So plenty of volume to go around for the RB1 in a Zach Taylor offense. And it was especially enticing, especially encouraging when the Cincinnati Bengals got near the goal line, which they figured to do plenty with Joe Burrow under center at quarterback. In each of the last 3 seasons, Joe Mixon finished either 3rd or 4th in running back targets inside the 5-yard line. He finished 3rd or 4th in running back rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, and he accounted for 93.8% or more of the Cincinnati Bengals rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line in each of the last 3 years. Translation, typically when the Cincinnati Bengals get down inside the 5-yard line, they have no problem putting it in the belly of their RB1 or whoever they consider to be their goal line back. Joe Mixon finished as fantasy's RB4, RB10, and RB6 in each of the last 3 years that he's played with Joe Burrow. There's no denying that the RB1 role in a Zach Taylor offense when Joe Burrow is playing quarterback, it's been a fruitful one over the last couple years. Now, it cannot be emphasized enough that neither one of these guys, Zach Moss or Chase Brown, are sure things in 2024 fantasy football. There are some very serious red flags to Zach Moss in 2024 fantasy football, many of which I covered already in episode 11 of Inside the 20. But it's not just Zach Moss. It's also Chase Brown. It's the Cincinnati Bengals offense in general. There are some red flags that should not be ignored as you're approaching these guys in your 2024 fantasy football drafts. I already covered both of them in tremendous detail inside of my 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, which is a resource. It's a cheat sheet that my customers are going to use in 2024 to dominate their drafts and get ahead of the competition before the season even begins. But this is an episode about players that are teed up for fantasy football relevant volume. This is an episode about players that are positioned well coming out of the NFL draft and heading towards the 2024 NFL season. And Zach Moss and Chase Brown fit the bill as they didn't suffer any additional blows coming out of the NFL draft. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A Forgemaster? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. Zamir White looks like a guy who's going to get his opportunity to be a full season feature back after his Las Vegas Raiders passed on higher ranked running back prospects like Trey Benson, Jalen Wright, Blake Corum, and instead waited until pick 208 overall, which was the 32nd pick in the 6th round, where they finally selected a running back. They chose Dylan Lobby out of New Hampshire. Dylan Lobby is a 25-year-old prospect who projects as more of a return specialist, a special teams player. He projects more as a role player type of guy than somebody who will make a significant dent in Zamir White's volume. Now, I do want to be fair to Dylan Lobby. He does bring a rather significant passing game presence to the NFL after he posted some terrific receiving numbers in college, albeit at a small school like New Hampshire. But still, he's proven him in the passing game. We know he's a capable receiver in the NFL. It's not out of the question that he gets work in passing situations in 2024, which would bring Zamir White off of the field in passing situations instead of making him a true workhorse or a true three-down bell cow that a lot of people are hoping he becomes. Now, while it's entirely possible that Dylan Lobby finds his way onto the football field in passing down situations in 2024, he's still a near 7th round pick in the NFL. And that in and of itself, that inherently makes Dylan Lobby far from a sure thing in any capacity. And it certainly makes him far from a sure thing to get on the field and make any kind of significant dent in Zamir White's workload. A workload, by the way, that looked absolutely mouthwatering for fantasy football purposes down the stretch in 2023. Over the last 4 games of last season, Zamir White averaged over 23 touches, 3 targets, 114 scrimmage yards, and 15 PPR points per game. He handled 20 or more touches in all 4 of those final games of the season last year, with Antonio Pierce operating as the head coach. 20 plus touches in every single game is a mouth-watering concept, okay? It's just something that doesn't exist in football very much anymore. It doesn't exist in fantasy football very much anymore. It's a terrific workload, probably not one that's actually sustainable, but still a very good sign for Zamir White's workload heading into the 2024 season. Now, less terrific than that workload was what Zamir White did with the workload. Despite handling 20 or more touches in all 4 games, he only scored between 13 and 18 PPR points in those 4 games. He never went over 18 PPR points. Now, to be fair, you'll take 13 PPR points in a fantasy league. You'll take 18 PPR points in a fantasy league. But typically, if a guy's going to handle the ball more than 20 times every single game, you would like to see him score more points on the fantasy football field. And to be candid, to be frank, there's plenty of red flags. Just like Zach Moss and Chase Brown, there's plenty of red flags to Zamir White in 2024 fantasy football. And again, I covered all of them in terrific detail in the 2024 fantasy football draft guide, which my customers are using for their fantasy football drafts. But either way, coming out of the NFL draft, which is what this episode is about, Zamir White does appear to be teed up for a significant workload at least. Now, what he does with that will be a question, but the workload, that shouldn't be a question. Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave, by the way, is about to be on a rocket ship to the moon. But Rashid Shaheed, he looks like a pretty big winner coming out of the NFL draft. He received minimal competition for targets when the New Orleans Saints waited until pick 170, which was the 35th pick in the 5th round, when they finally selected their only pass catcher, nabbing Pittsburgh's wide receiver Bub Means, a guy who, by the way, began his collegiate career playing defensive back for the Tennessee Volunteers. Now, Bub Means himself, he has speed to burn. Lots of speed. He has the ability to get onto the football field as a big play threat, as a deep threat in the NFL, but he likely doesn't have the means. Get it? Means?
Did that go the way you thought it was going to go? Nope.
He likely doesn't have the means to unseat Rashid Shaheed as the Saints wide receiver 2, at least in 2024 here in year 1. So not only did Rashid Shaheed receive minimal competition for targets through the NFL draft, but now he has a legitimate chance to solidify himself as the team's wide receiver 2 beginning in week 1, something that didn't happen last year because the team still had Michael Thomas. Now this year, Michael Thomas is gone. He's out of the picture, and now Rashid Shaheed has a chance to be the full-time wide receiver 2 in week 1. And last year, when he was kind of shoehorned into that role when Michael Thomas inevitably went down with another injury, Shaheed still averaged a modest 10.1 PPR points and 5 targets per game with Derek Carr. So there's plenty of room for growth entering year 2 with Derek Carr. And now, this time, being the team's full-time wide receiver 2 heading into week 1. Now, we should note that the New Orleans Saints did make some moves in free agency this year, but none of them are particularly noteworthy or significant threats to Rashid Shaheed's target volume. They signed Cedric Wilson, who recently played for the Miami Dolphins and failed to separate himself as the third option in the passing game behind Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And the Saints also signed Equanimeous St. Brown, who recently played for the Chicago Bears and failed to establish himself as a receiving threat despite the Bears pretty much only having DJ Moore to throw to last year and Darnell Mooney in years prior to that. Last year, the Saints also drafted A.T. Perry in the 6th round of the NFL draft. But again, all of these guys project as more of depth pieces for the New Orleans Saints. They don't project as somebody who is a legitimate threat to pass Rashid Shaheed in line for wide receiver 2 duties in New Orleans playing for Derek Carr. And as for Chris Olave, by the way, as for the guy who was the 11th overall pick in the NFL draft in 2022, his competition for targets, by the way, is quite literally a group of guys who were drafted no higher than the 5th round of their respective NFL drafts. Rashid Shaheed, Cedric Wilson, A.T. Perry, Equanimeous St. Brown, Bub Means, Juwan Johnson, all of those guys. Not a single one of them was drafted higher than the 5th round in their NFL draft. Of course, you got Alvin Kamara, but the point is, Chris Olave should get as many targets as he can possibly stomach in 2024. He's entering year 3, which, by the way, is the common breakout year for a young wide receiver in the NFL. Now, with back-to-back seasons over 1,000 yards already, Chris Olave doesn't really need to break out. But the point is, year 3 is usually eruption year for so many young receivers in the NFL historically. He averaged 14.3 PPR points and 8.6 targets per game in his first season with Derek Carr last year. Plenty of room for growth in year 2 with Derek Carr, and he is set for liftoff. Put this guy on a rocket ship and send him to the moon. He is set for liftoff under new offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak, who I discussed in great detail in episode 5 of Inside the 20. Growing up, one of my favorite things to do was play Madden on my PlayStation, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5. And when I say play Madden, what I really mean is simulate the games and simulate the seasons, because my favorite part was managing the team, scouting prospects, doing the draft, making trades, signing free agents, and everything that goes into managing a football team and leading a franchise to glory, building it from the ground up. And if that's your type of deal, if you love that sort of thing, you're going to absolutely love GM Dynasty, which is a simulated football game that I recently started playing and instantly fell in love with. With realistic game planning mechanics and immersive features, GM Dynasty puts you in the hot seat of sports management. And it's not just a game. It's a simulation of the real deal. I invite you to get your free team and compete in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's upcoming tournament, where there's going to be prizes for whoever wins the thing. Register your account on gmdynasty.com, and when you do, join the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football contest using the link that we left for you in the show notes. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's get deep into the weeds of 2024 fantasy football drafts. Let's talk about late-round targets. And one of my new favorites in 2024 best ball drafts is Demarcus Robinson, who suddenly looks like a really sneaky late-round draft pick in 2024 fantasy football leagues after the Rams declined to select a pass catcher until the 213th pick in the NFL draft, which was the 37th pick in the 6th round, where they finally took Texas Longhorns slot receiver Jordan Whittington. Now, Whittington himself, he's already a 24-year-old prospect who offers very little reason for anybody to believe that he will get ahead of Robinson or even Tutu Atwell, Ben Skoranek, or anybody else in that Rams offense in line for Matthew Stafford targets behind target hogs like Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. Now, we've already seen Demarcus Robinson operate as the wide receiver 3 for the Rams. We have data to lean on, and it's a small sample size, but it's really, really encouraging data. Demarcus Robinson low-key balled out as the wide receiver 3 for the Rams down the stretch last season, averaging 14-plus PPR points and 6-plus targets per game over the final 6 full games that Demarcus Robinson played with the Rams as their wide receiver 3. He scored 13 or more PPR points in 5 of the last 6 full games, including a high on the season of 20.2 PPR points in Week 16. And these are games that the Rams played with Puka Nacua, with Cooper Kupp, and Demarcus Robinson was still making some noise, quiet noise, but still making some noise as the Rams wide receiver 3 down the stretch in 2023. Now, in 2024, Demarcus Robinson is currently being drafted as Fantasy's wide receiver 82. He's basically free. He's being drafted around pick 217 overall, which is an early 19th round pick in 12-team leagues. And in 2024 best ball drafts, that is a cost we're more than willing. We're happy to pay an early 19th round pick for a guy who offers some fantasy football upside if he can just hang on to that wide receiver 3 role in LA. And if he doesn't, all we've lost is an early 19th round pick. He's well worth that cost. He's well worth taking a flyer in 2024 fantasy football drafts. Tyler Conklin survived a Brock Bowers scare when the New York Jets passed on Brock Bowers and instead opted for Penn State offensive tackle Olu Muyiwa. I did it.
King in the castle.
First try. Olumuyiwa Fashanu with the 11th overall pick in the NFL draft. Now that decision to pass on Brock Bowers, that left Tyler Conklin atop the New York Jets depth chart for at least another season, giving him an opportunity to play meaningful snaps in an Aaron Rodgers offense. Now, of course, Garrett Wilson, who is a 10th overall pick in 2022, and free agent Mike Williams, who was a former 7th overall pick in his own right, those two guys are undoubtedly first and second in line for targets from Aaron Rodgers, not to mention Breece Hall, not to mention their 3rd round pick Malachi Corley, not to mention Aaron Rodgers' best buddy Alan Lazard. All of those guys will be involved as pass catchers in Aaron Rodgers' offense in 2024. But still, Tyler Conklin himself, although likely not consistently, Conklin himself should have his fair share of fantasy useful weeks in 2024 fantasy football. He's going to be catching passes from a Hall of Fame quarterback who got tight end 9, 12, and 14 seasons out of Jermichael Finley. He got tight end 12 seasons out of Richard Rodgers and Jimmy Graham. He made Robert Tonyan Fantasy's tight end number 4 in 2020. Again, Conklin himself, it's not going to be consistent. He's not a guy that should be drafted in your normal size fantasy football leagues, but he is going to offer streamer viability in 2024 and in best ball leagues. Tyler Conklin is a terrific number 3 tight end in best ball drafts where he's well worth his current ADP, average draft position, being drafted as Fantasy's tight end 25 around pick 194 overall, which is an early 17th round pick in 12-team drafts. He's well worth that cost as a tight end 3 in best ball leagues. I want to take a quick second to congratulate Roy Gully, a Basement Brood fantasy football customer who won BBFF's mock draft challenge during the NFL draft and took home his choice of an autographed NFL jersey courtesy of our partners, BS Collectibles. Now, Roy, the Titans fan that he is, he chose a powder blue Oilers jersey by none other than Earl Campbell himself, the 3rd all-time leading rusher in Houston Oilers, Tennessee Titans history. And the great friend that Roy is, he promptly donated that jersey to his own buddy, whose last name just so happens to be Campbell, who played running back in the day, and who wore number 34. Congratulations, Roy, and good on you for donating that jersey to your friend. Now, speaking of Basement Brood fantasy football contests, I'd like to take a quick minute to invite you to our next one. We are hosting the BBFF Jersey Bowl, which is a 12-team PPR best ball draft where the winner is going to take home their choice of an autographed NFL jersey. Check out the link that we left for you in the show notes for more details and or to enter the contest. All right, quick little rapid fire bonus session for you. Let me run you through a couple names that I wrote down in my list when considering names to include in this episode of draft day winners, players that are teed up for fantasy football relevance following the NFL draft. I also wrote down Ezekiel Elliott, right? The Dallas Cowboys never added another running back via the draft, so they went ahead and brought in a familiar face with Ezekiel Elliott, and just like that, instantly, he sits atop the depth chart as the team's RB1 headed towards the 2024 season. Of course, he's a shell of himself. He's not anything near what he used to be, but there should be plenty of volume to make Ezekiel Elliott fantasy football relevant heading into 2024. I wrote down Jonathan Taylor. Not that we were expecting the Colts to add a running back in the NFL draft, but the fact that they didn't means that it's pretty much just Jonathan Taylor and a bunch of nobodies behind him on the depth chart. There's no meaningful RB2 like there was Zach Moss last year to take the pressure off of Jonathan Taylor. It's just guys like Trey Sermon, Evan Hull. Jonathan Taylor should get all the volume that he can handle in 2024 football and 2024 fantasy football. Very similar story to Isaiah Pacheco. We weren't exactly expecting the Chiefs to add a running back, but the fact that they didn't means it's just the Isaiah Pacheco show with nothing but Clyde Edwards-Helaire behind him on the depth chart. We can expect more of the same, more of what we've seen from Isaiah Pacheco moving forward in 2024 fantasy football. Then we got Gus Edwards. And yes, the Chargers did add Keimani Vidal. And Keimani Vidal is somebody that I am targeting in my 2024 best ball drafts. I literally just talked about him in episode 15 of Inside the 20, where I talked about 5 rookies that landed in dream scenarios. But he's still a bit of a long shot in the NFL being such a late round pick, and headed towards week 1 of the 2024 season, Gus Edwards is penciled in as the Chargers' RB1 in a Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman offense. And if you ever listen to episode 1 of Inside the 20, the RB1 in a Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman offense, that's somebody you want to target in fantasy football. Heading over to New York and the Giants, we have Daniel Jones, who's accidentally falling back into a starting quarterback role in the NFL. And Daniel Jones does offer at least a little bit of sneaky fantasy football upside, considering what he does with his legs from time to time. And by the way, they just added one of the top prospects over the last several years in Malik Neighbors at wide receiver. Daniel Jones is basically free in best ball drafts right now. Last but not least, keeping it in New York with the Giants. The Giants didn't really add a particularly noteworthy name at running back in the NFL draft, leaving Devin Singletary penciled in as the RB1 headed towards week 1. Now, the Giants did add Tyrone Tracy, and like Keimani Vidal, that Tyrone Tracy is a guy that I'm targeting in the late rounds of my best ball drafts. But for now, headed towards week 1, Devin Singletary looks like he should at least get enough volume to pay RB3 and flex dividends heading towards week 1 of the 2024 fantasy football season. If you enjoyed today's episode, then I promise you, you are going to enjoy all of our recent episodes of Inside the 20, where we've been discussing the shifting fantasy football landscape as a result of the NFL draft, free agency, coaching changes inside the NFL, and you can find all of them on the Inside the 20 playlist right here on the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football YouTube channel. And if you like this content in general, I have 3 different ways that you can get more of it. Number 1 is to subscribe to the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football YouTube channel, where we post episodes every single Friday. Number 2, subscribe to the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football newsletter using the link that we left for you in the show notes of this episode. And number 3, consider purchasing a subscription to basementbrewedff.com, where you're going to be able to use our analysis, our cheat sheets, and our online community to outsmart your friends, dominate your leagues, take down DFS contests, cash in on NFL bets, and a lot more. That's all for right now, but come back every Friday for more league-wrecking fantasy football insights. I'll see you on the fantasy football field next Friday. Cheers. This brew's for you.